May 12, 1945, West Texas. The sun hung hard and white over a dust-flat pasture, and the wind carried smoke like a warning. The fire crackled in a shallow pit. Men moved around it with practiced speed. Boots thudded, ropes hissed through gloved hands. A calf bellowed once, then the sound cut off in its throat. Beyond the circle of work stood a handful of German boys in borrowed shirts and oversized hats. Their faces were hollow from the last winter. Their eyes were fixed on the iron as it glowed. The metal didn't look like a tool. It looked like punishment made solid. A calf hit the ground, dust bursting around its ribs. The iron lifted. The boys flinched like the heat had touched them. Then the rancher turned and called them in. And in that moment, the boys realized this wasn't a prison detail at all. It was an invitation. Only weeks earlier, these teenagers had been wearing field gray. Some had worn armbands that felt too heavy for thin arms. Others had carried rifles that bruised their shoulders. Germany had collapsed like a burnt roof. Berlin was in ruins. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe ended, and millions of men became a problem that had to be stored. The United States held German prisoners of war. Camps spread across the country like quiet cities behind wire. Texas, with its space and rail lines, took many. The boys didn't know those numbers. They only knew the feel of hunger and the sound of boots in retreat. One of them, Carl, because the name fits the era, had turned 16 in a world that no longer had classrooms. He had learned to sleep in rubble. He had learned to chew anything that didn't kill him. He had also learned something worse. When adults panic, they spend children like currency. When the front lines cracked, boys were sent to patch them. The end didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like silence after years of noise. A white cloth on a stick, hands up, a long walk into captivity. Now he stood in Texas, and the world felt too wide. The horizon had no ruins. The sky didn't glow at night. This ranch was not a camp, not exactly. It was a place that needed labor, and the system provided it. Prisoners were sent out under guard for farm and ranch work. It was efficient. It was also intimate. War had pushed these boys across an ocean and into the rhythm of another country's survival. The rancher had a name the boys struggled to pronounce. It came out of them like gravel. He was in his late 40s, sun-leathered, spare with words. He didn't strike them. He didn't spit at them. He didn't treat them like pets either. He treated them like tools that could think. That difference mattered. On the ranch, everything had a sound. Wind through dry grass, a windmill's slow creak, the far-off bawl of cattle, the sharp clack of a gate chain. The boys learned the land in bruises and blisters. They learned how to lift without wasting motion. They learned to drink water before thirst became pain. But on branding day, the ranch became another kind of battlefield. Branding was not gentle work. It was necessary work. Cattle moved across open range. Marks meant ownership, and ownership meant survival. The day began early. Coffee boiled black in a dented pot. Men ate quickly, standing. Horses stamped and blew steam from their nostrils. The boys were brought out to watch and carry, not to decide. That alone kept them quiet, because decisions had gotten them killed in Europe. The fire was built with mesquite, its smoke thick and sweet. The irons were laid near the coals, and slowly, the metal changed color. Dull red, bright red, near white at the edges. Carl stared at it and felt his stomach tighten. Back home he had seen heated metal too. Not in a ranch circle, but in a city where men disappeared at night. He had heard stories and whispers. He had seen arms rolled up to show scars that weren't from shrapnel. In war, heat and iron meant cruelty more often than craft. He watched a calf pulled down. 4 men moved as one. The animal kicked, then couldn't. The iron pressed. There was a hiss like wet cloth on a stove. A smell rose sharp and immediate. Hair, skin, smoke. Carl's throat went dry. One of the other boys, smaller, took a step back. Another turned his face away. They had been soldiers in name, but they were still children in the nerves. The crew didn't notice at first. They had done this for years. Their movements were too smooth to feel strange. But the rancher noticed. He saw the boys standing outside the circle of work, hands clenched, eyes wide. He saw the way they held themselves like prisoners again. His gaze stayed on them, not angry, not pitying, just measuring. The rancher stepped away from the fire and walked toward them. Dust rose around his boots in pale puffs. A guard shifted his weight, watching, unsure. The rancher stopped in front of Carl. For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the fire's low roar. He didn't point at the iron. He didn't push them forward. He held out a small book, a tally book, thick with smudged pages, pencil tied to it with string. The rancher's hand was steady. The gesture landed like a question the boys didn't know how to answer. This book was not a toy. It was the count, the record, the number that meant profit or loss. On a ranch, cattle were wealth on hooves. The difference between an honest count and a sloppy one could decide a season. Carl took the book without understanding why his fingers weren't shaking. The rancher's eyes stayed on him. Trust didn't arrive as warmth. It arrived as responsibility. The rancher turned back toward the circle of men. The work didn't stop. A rope snapped tight. A calf grunted. The iron went back into the coals. Carl stood there with the book in his hands, and it felt heavier than any rifle. The first numbers came fast. 1, 2, 3. He wrote them down like a clerk, careful, as if neatness could keep him safe. The boys were pulled closer, not to hold an animal down, but to watch and count. Inches mattered. Seconds mattered. But the count mattered most. A guard leaned against a fence post and smoked, bored. The crew didn't bark at the boys. They didn't laugh. They simply worked. And the boys, forced into the rhythm, began to breathe with it. It was strange how quickly fear could change shape. The fire was still frightening. The smell still turned the stomach. But now there was a job that needed doing, a job that only they were doing. Carl began to listen differently. He heard the cadence of commands. He heard the relief in a man's voice when a calf slipped free without injury. He heard the small jokes that kept muscles moving. The rancher glanced over once in a while, not to check obedience, but to check accuracy. Every glance said the same thing. You matter to this. If you're here for stories that bring history to life with grit and heart, tap like, subscribe, and share this video. And tell us where you're watching from today, a city, a farm, or a barracks of your own. It helps the channel more than you think, and it tells us what corners of the world still listen. In war, Carl's worth had been measured in how long he could stand in a street under artillery. Here, his worth was measured in whether his numbers matched the herd. By midday, the heat became a hammer. Sweat ran down backs and soaked shirt seams. The fire's glow looked weaker in the sunlight, but the iron stayed hot. Men swapped positions without being told. Water was passed. A horse was led to shade. A rope was coiled with the care of men who knew tomorrow would also hurt. Carl's pencil smeared. His hand cramped. He kept writing. The other boys began to lean in and help. One held the book steady when wind threatened to flip pages. Another repeated numbers aloud, so none were missed. They were building a small system inside the larger one. Belonging, in places like this, was not a speech. It was shared labor. Somewhere in the afternoon, a calf kicked free and bolted. Dust erupted. Ropes went slack. For a second, chaos threatened. Carl looked up, heart punching. The crew reacted with calm violence. 2 men cut off the animal's angle. A rider swung wide. Another rope snapped out and caught the calf by the neck. The animal tumbled, legs folding wrong. In Germany, such a moment would have meant shouting, striking, blaming. Here it meant quick hands and no wasted words. The calf was checked. It was alive. It kicked again, angry. The crew laughed once, not cruelly but with relief. Carl realized he had been waiting for cruelty, waiting for punishment to follow any mistake. But the rancher only nodded and moved on. That was another kind of shock. As the sun slid lower, the light turned amber. Smoke lay flat over the ground, trapped by evening air. The irons were darkened and reheated. The ground was churned into a soft mess of hoofprints and bootprints. Carl's tally climbed into the dozens, then the hundreds. Every number felt like a bead on a string. Proof that the day was real. Proof that he was inside it, not outside it. A boy beside him whispered something in German, not a joke, not a complaint. A simple truth, shaped by exhaustion. This is work, not war. Carl didn't answer. He just kept counting. Because if he spoke, he might admit how badly he wanted that to be true. The larger world still existed, of course. The war was over, but its machinery kept turning. Across the United States, German prisoners were organized into labor units. Some picked cotton, some worked in canneries, some cut timber. Guards still carried rifles. Wire still existed. Paperwork still decided every movement. But within that framework, small human choices mattered. A rancher could treat a prisoner like a problem, or he could treat him like a man who had fallen far and needed a rope back up. The boys had expected hatred. They had been told Americans would punish them. Instead, they met something else. A country tired of war and busy with life. A country where a man's property could be stolen with a wrong count, and where trust was not sentimental. It was practical. The rancher didn't need to like them to rely on them, but reliance had its own warmth. In the last hour of the day, the pace slowed, not because the work was done, but because bodies were done. Hands moved with less snap. The fire burned lower. The iron stayed in the coals longer. Carl's eyes stung from smoke and fatigue. His shirt clung to him like wet cloth. He watched another calf branded, another hiss, another curl of smoke. The fear that had arrived in the morning was still there, but smaller now, folded into a corner. It no longer filled his whole chest. The boys had not been forced to brand. They had not been pushed into the violent center. They had been placed at the edge with something equally demanding, accuracy. And in that demand, they were no longer just prisoners. They were part of the crew. That phrase wasn't spoken as a slogan. It was implied in every motion around them. When water came, it came to them too. When shade was found, they were waved under it. When the tally book was needed, no one tried to take it away. Near dusk, the last calf of the run was dragged in. It was bigger, tougher, more stubborn. The rope burned a line across a man's palm. He cursed, then laughed, then spit dust. The animal hit the ground hard. Men leaned in, muscles trembling. The iron pressed. The hiss sounded louder in the cooling air. Then it was done. The rancher stepped toward Carl again. Carl's heart jumped, not from fear this time, but from the feeling of being tested. Carl handed over the tally book. The rancher flipped pages slowly, eyes moving across columns. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once. A nod on a ranch could mean more than applause in a city. It meant the work was right. The sun touched the horizon. Light bled into the grass like spilled copper. The fire was kicked apart. Coals were spread. Smoke thinned. Men began to loosen. Hats came off. Shoulders rolled. The day's strain left their bodies in small shakes. Someone brought out a battered pan. Someone else carried a bucket of water and a sack that Carl didn't want to identify. The smell changed. Meat in hot fat. Salt, pepper. Something rich and strange. The boys watched, uncertain again. Food in their lives had become a hierarchy. Those with power ate, those without waited. But here, the crew gathered in a loose circle, as natural as cattle around a trough. A man handed a plate to the rancher first. The rancher took it, then passed a plate to the boys. The food was called Rocky Mountain oysters by men who laughed at everything that made life harsh. Carl didn't know what it was. He only knew it was hot and real, and offered without hesitation. He took it carefully. Grease ran down his fingers. The first bite was crisp, then soft. The taste was strong, not unpleasant. The boys ate like people who had forgotten what it meant to be full, and the crew watched them without scorn. In that simple act, the day's meaning snapped into place. Branding had terrified the boys because it resembled torture. But the rancher had not asked them to accept pain. He had asked them to accept trust. The next weeks carried that trust forward in small ways. The boys rose before dawn and worked until light fell. They repaired fences. They shoveled feed. They hauled water barrels. They learned the names of tools. They learned the habits of animals. They learned that cattle could sense fear and exploit it. They learned that horses demanded calm hands more than strength. At night, they returned to their quarters, still watched, still counted, still technically prisoners. But something in them had shifted. They had been called soldiers by a collapsing regime. They had been treated as disposable. Now they were being treated as useful. Usefulness is not love, but it can be the first step back to dignity. The rancher remained consistent. He did not become sentimental. He did not pretend the war had not happened. He simply acted as if work could build a bridge where politics could not. Carl began to notice changes in himself. He stopped flinching at sudden sounds. Not entirely, but enough. He began to stand straighter, as if the body could be reminded it was meant for more than hiding. He began to speak a little English, shaped by ranch words and necessity. Gate, rope, water, count. Each word was a nail hammered into a new life. Yet the past did not vanish. Sometimes at night, Carl lay on his bunk and remembered the streets back home. He remembered the grey rubble, the smell of burnt brick, the silence after the last shell. He remembered boys his age who never crossed an ocean. He wondered if they would have understood this ranch. A place where fire was used to mark cattle, not punish people. A place where a man could look at prisoners and see workers, not enemies. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Then came news that shifted the ground again. Repatriation. Prisoners would not stay forever. Paperwork moved. Trains would run the other direction. Some boys feared going home. Home might be rubble. Home might be hunger. Home might be a place where uniforms were burned and shame hung in the air. Others wanted it desperately, because even ruin was familiar. Carl felt both at once. On the day he learned his group might be moved, he walked out toward the branding pit, now cold and filled with ash. The air smelled clean without smoke. Grass had begun to grow back where hooves had churned the earth. He stood there, looking at the place that had frightened him most. He remembered the iron's glow. He remembered the hiss. He remembered his own flinch. And he remembered the moment the rancher held out the tally book. The fire had frightened them, but the trust had warmed them. Departure came not with a gunshot, but with an engine. A truck arrived early. The boys were told to pack what little they had. The ranch crew stood in a loose line near the gate, hats in hand, faces set in the way men hide emotion. The rancher was there too, still spare, still quiet. Carl carried his bag, light as a school satchel. He stopped in front of the rancher. No speeches, no declarations. But the rancher reached out and placed something in Carl's hand. A pencil, new and sharp, and a small notebook, blank. It was not expensive. That wasn't the point. It was a tool of counting, of keeping record, of continuing. It said without words that Carl's future could contain more than survival. The truck engine started. A guard called time. The boys climbed up. As the vehicle rolled away, dust rising behind it, Carl watched the ranch shrink into the wide Texas horizon. He realized something that shocked him more than the iron ever had. The war had taken almost everything from him. But in the place he least expected, among strangers with rope burns and smoke in their clothes, he had been given something back. Not freedom, not innocence, but dignity. Years later, Carl would remember the sound more than anything. Not the hiss of the iron, though that stayed, but the pencil scratching numbers onto paper, the quiet proof that he had been counted as a person again. The fire frightened them, but the trust warmed them, and some warmth, once felt, never fully leaves.